The emergency klaxons screamed through the cargo hauler times, resilient dawn times, as Sarah Chen fought with the controls. Sparks flew from the navigation console while warning lights bathed the cramped cockpit in angry red. Through the viewport, the desert planet Xerion 7 rushed toward her at a terrifying speed. "Come on, you stubborn piece of junk," Sarah muttered, her calloused hands dancing over the manual override switches. 20 years as a deep space mechanic had taught her that machines responded better to understanding than panic. Even as her ship plummeted towards certain doom, she kept her voice steady and her movements precise. The atmospheric entry tore at the hauler's hull like invisible claws. Sarah had jury-rigged the life support systems 3 days ago when the primary power coupling failed, and now those patch jobs were being tested beyond their limits. The artificial gravity flickered on and off, making her stomach lurch as loose tools floated past her face. She'd been hauling rare earth minerals from the outer rim when everything went wrong at once. First, the hyperspace motivator had developed a harmonic resonance that threatened to tear the ship apart. Then the navigation computer started giving readings that made no sense. Finally, the fusion reactor began showing signs of cascade failure, forcing her to drop out of hyperspace in the middle of nowhere. The middle of nowhere happened to be the Xerion system, and the only planet within emergency landing range was this burned-out wasteland of sand and rock. The planetary database listed it as uninhabited and resource-poor, with surface temperatures that could cook a person in their EVA suit. Perfect for a vacation, Sarah thought grimly. The ship's belly scraped against something solid, sending vibrations through the deck plates. Sarah managed to fire the emergency retro thrusters just long enough to slow their descent from catastrophic to merely dangerous. The time's resilient dawn times hit the desert floor with a bone-jarring crash that threw Sarah against her restraints and sent every unsecured item in the ship flying. Silence followed the impact, broken only by the soft hiss of atmosphere leaking somewhere in the aft section. Sarah hung in her pilot's chair for a moment, taking inventory. Her ribs ached, and she tasted copper in her mouth, but nothing felt broken. The ship's systems showed a dozen critical failures and twice as many warnings, but the hull integrity held at 68%. "Could be worse," Sarah said aloud, a habit she'd developed during long solo runs. Her voice sounded strange in the sudden quiet. "Could be on fire." She unbuckled herself and floated to the engineering station, where the diagnostic displays told the story she expected. The hyperspace motivator was completely fried, its crystalline matrix shattered beyond repair. The fusion reactor had scrammed safely, but its control circuits would need a complete rebuild. Most of the sensor array was offline, and the communication system was showing nothing but static. Sarah pulled up the ship's inventory on a working screen. The good news was that she carried a full machine shop in the cargo bay, along with enough spare parts to rebuild a small fleet. The bad news was that some of those parts were now scattered across several square kilometers of desert floor. She suited up in her EVA gear, checking the seals twice before cycling through the airlock. The desert heat hit her immediately, even through the suit's cooling systems. The local star hung like a malevolent eye in the pale yellow sky, and the horizon shimmered with heat, mirages in every direction. The time's resilient dawn times had carved a trench 300 meters long through the sand before coming to rest against a low ridge of red stone. Debris from the cargo bay was scattered along the crash path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Sarah activated her suit's magnetic recovery system and began the tedious work of gathering the pieces of her livelihood. The portable fabricator had survived the crash intact, protected by its armored casing. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders when its status lights blinked green. With the fabricator, she could manufacture any part she didn't already have in inventory, assuming she could find the raw materials. That led to her next discovery. The redstone ridge wasn't just rock, it was iron ore so pure it practically gleamed in the sunlight. Sarah ran her scanner over the exposed surface and whistled softly at the readings. 96% iron content, with traces of nickel, chromium, and other useful alloys. It was like finding a treasure chest in the middle of hell. Over the next 3 days, Sarah fell into a routine that would have impressed a military logistics officer. She rose with the alien sun and worked until the heat became too dangerous, then retreated to the ship during the scorching midday hours to plan and fabricate parts. The evenings were for installation and testing, working under portable lights while the temperature dropped to merely uncomfortable. She started with the life support systems, rebuilding the air recyclers with improved filters that could handle the fine sand constantly infiltrating the ship. The water reclamation system got new pumps and purification modules. Sarah had learned long ago that you could fix almost anything if you could breathe clean air and drink clean water while you worked. The fusion reactor came next. The control circuits required delicate work. Building new processing units from raw silicon and rare earth elements she extracted from the ore deposits. Sarah's hands moved with the confidence of decades of experience, splicing optical cables and calibrating sensor arrays with the precision of a surgeon. The communication system proved more challenging. The main transmitter had been damaged beyond repair, but Sarah discovered she could network together 3 of the ship's emergency beacons to create a makeshift long-range array. It wouldn't win any engineering awards, but it might be enough to call for help once she fixed the power distribution problems. On the 4th day, while fabricating new control circuits for the hyperspace motivator, Sarah noticed something odd about her scanner readings. The iron ore she'd been mining showed signs of artificial refinement, not natural geological processes, but deliberate purification techniques. Someone had been here before, someone with advanced metallurgy. She expanded her survey, working outward from the crash site in careful spirals. 2 kilometers from the ship, she found the first structure. It wasn't much to look at, just a low dome of the same red stone as the ridge, barely visible above the shifting sand. But when Sarah cleared away the accumulated debris, she discovered smooth, machined surfaces that spoke of advanced engineering. The dome was made from the purified iron ore, forged into plates, and joined with molecular welding techniques that rivaled anything in human space. The entrance was sealed, but not locked. Sarah's tools made quick work of the metal covering, revealing a chamber that extended deep into the bedrock. Emergency lighting flickered on as she stepped inside, powered by some unknown energy source that had operated faithfully for who knows how many years. The chamber was a workshop, filled with tools and machines that Sarah recognized despite their alien design. Here was a forge that could work metals at the molecular level. There was a fabrication unit that made her own equipment look like toys. Most intriguing of all was a workbench covered in half-finished projects, devices that seemed to combine mechanical engineering with crystalline matrices in ways that human science was only beginning to understand. Sarah activated her suit's recording system and began documenting everything. The builders of this place had clearly been master engineers. But where were they now? The workshop showed no signs of violence or hasty evacuation. Tools were neatly stored, projects carefully preserved. It was as if the workers had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. She was examining what looked like a 3-dimensional circuit diagram when her proximity alarm chimed. Something was moving outside the workshop. Sarah drew her plasma cutter and moved carefully toward the entrance. Through the opening, she could see a figure approaching across the sand, humanoid. But clearly not human. It walked with a strange, flowing gait that seemed to glide over the shifting dunes. As it drew closer, Sarah could make out details that made her breath catch. The being stood nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that looked like living metal. Its limbs were elongated and graceful, and its head was a smooth oval, without visible features except for 2 crystalline structures that might have been eyes. It wore no clothing, but its metallic skin was decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as Sarah watched. The creature stopped at the entrance to the workshop and waited. It made no threatening gestures, showed no weapons, and seemed content to stand there as long as necessary. After a long moment, it raised one hand in what could only be a gesture of greeting. Sarah's mind raced. First contact protocols were clear: establish peaceful intentions, avoid sudden movements, attempt communication through universal concepts like mathematics or physics. But those protocols were written for encounters in space or on colony worlds, not for meeting aliens in their own abandoned workshop. She holstered her plasma cutter and stepped forward slowly, raising her own hand in response. The alien's head tilted slightly, and the crystalline structures that might have been eyes brightened with inner light. "I'm Sarah," she said, knowing the words would mean nothing but hoping her tone would convey friendliness. "I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. My ship crashed, and I was looking for materials to repair it." The alien listened to her words, then turned and gestured toward the workshop's interior. It moved past her with that same flowing grace, its feet making no sound on the metal floor. At the workbench, it touched one of the half-finished devices, and suddenly the air filled with complex three-dimensional diagrams that Sarah recognized as hyperspace equations. The math was elegant beyond anything human science had achieved. Where human hyperspace theory required brute force calculations and massive energy expenditures, these equations described gentle manipulations of space-time that used a fraction of the power. Sarah stared at the floating diagrams, her engineer's mind immediately grasping the implications. The alien touched another device, and new diagrams appeared: energy conversion systems, matter transmission protocols, gravitational manipulation techniques. Each breakthrough represented centuries of human research, compressed into a few flowing equations. "You're trying to help me," Sarah whispered. "You're showing me how to fix my ship." The alien turned those crystalline eyes toward her, and Sarah felt a strange warmth, as if something was gently touching her thoughts. Images flowed through her mind, not words, but concepts and emotions. Curiosity about this strange visitor, admiration for her mechanical skills, and underneath it all, a profound loneliness. More images came, telling a story without words. The aliens had been explorers and engineers, spreading across the galaxy to study and learn. But something had gone wrong. A plague, or perhaps just the inevitable entropy that claimed all civilizations. One by one, their worlds had fallen silent. This workshop was a monument to a dying race, maintained by automated systems and the last few survivors. Sarah saw herself through the alien's perception, a young species taking its first steps into the galaxy, driven by the same curiosity and ingenuity that had once motivated its own people. In her stubborn determination to repair her ship against impossible odds, the alien saw an echo of its own race's finest qualities. "You're the last one, aren't you?" Sarah asked softly. The response came as a gentle touch of sadness, tinged with acceptance. The alien had been waiting here for countless years, maintaining the workshop and hoping that someday, someone would come who could appreciate what its people had built, someone who might carry their knowledge forward into the future. The alien moved to another part of the workshop and activated a storage unit Sarah hadn't noticed before. Inside were crystalline matrices unlike anything in human technology, power sources that could run for millennia, data storage devices that contained the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization, and tools that could manipulate matter at the quantum level. With careful gestures, the alien explained how each device functioned. The explanations came not as words, but as direct understanding, Sarah's mind suddenly grasping principles of engineering that human science wouldn't discover for centuries. It was like having a master craftsman guide her hands while she learned techniques that had taken generations to perfect. Over the next several hours, Sarah learned more about advanced engineering than she had in her entire previous career. The alien was a patient teacher, demonstrating concepts with elegant simplicity and encouraging her to experiment with the tools. When she made mistakes, it gently corrected her technique. When she grasped a particularly complex principle, Sarah felt its approval like warm sunshine. As the day wore on, Sarah began to understand that she was being given more than just knowledge. She was being entrusted with a legacy. The aliens' people had spent millions of years learning to work in harmony with the fundamental forces of the universe. Now, as the last of its kind, it was passing that wisdom to humanity. "Why me?" Sarah asked during a break in their work. The answer came as images and emotions rather than words. The alien had observed her work over the past few days, watching as she tackled impossible problems with determination and creativity. It had seen her treating her ship with respect rather than frustration, coaxing performance from damaged systems through understanding rather than force. In her approach to engineering, it recognized the qualities its own people had valued: patience, ingenuity, and a deep appreciation for the elegant solutions that nature provided. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. She was just a mechanic, a grease monkey who fixed cargo haulers for a living. But this ancient being saw something in her worth preserving and passing on. As the alien sun began to set, painting the workshop in shades of gold and red, the alien led Sarah to the most important device in the chamber. It was a crystalline matrix the size of her fist, containing what looked like trapped lightning. The alien carefully lifted it from its housing and offered it to Sarah. The moment her fingers touched the crystal, knowledge flooded her mind. This was more than a power source. It was a complete technological database, containing the engineering principles of an entire civilization. Everything from basic metallurgy to hyperspace manipulation, from quantum computing to biological engineering, it was the gift of knowledge that could advance humanity by centuries. But with the knowledge came responsibility. The aliens' people had learned through bitter experience that technology without wisdom led to destruction. The power to reshape matter could create or destroy. The ability to manipulate space-time could unite civilizations or tear them apart. The crystal would only reveal its secrets to those who approached it with humility and respect. As darkness fell over the workshop, Sarah understood that her crash landing on Zirion 7 hadn't been an accident. Somehow, in ways she couldn't fully comprehend, she had been guided here. The aliens' people might be gone, but their greatest achievement, the wisdom to use power responsibly, would live on through humanity. She carefully secured the crystal in her toolkit and prepared to return to her ship. But as she reached the workshop entrance, the alien stopped her with a gentle touch. In the fading light, it gestured toward the night sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Sarah followed its gaze and gasped. The stars weren't just points of light, they were moving, forming patterns that shifted and danced across the heavens. Some were growing brighter while others dimmed. It was beautiful and mysterious, and somehow familiar. The alien's touch on her mind explained what she was seeing. The star patterns weren't natural, they were signals, messages from other survivors scattered across the galaxy. The aliens' people weren't completely extinct after all. They had simply evolved beyond the need for physical form, becoming beings of pure energy and thought. But they still needed the next generation to carry on their work in the physical realm. They needed species like humanity to explore and build and dream with the same passion that had once driven them. As Sarah walked back toward her ship under the dancing stars, she felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of repairing the time's resilient dawn asterisk. But she wouldn't be doing it alone, and she wouldn't be using purely human technology. The desert wind whispered around her as she climbed aboard her ship, carrying with it the promise of wonders yet to be discovered. Sarah Chen had come to Zirion 7 as a stranded mechanic. She would leave as humanity's first ambassador to the stars. Sarah woke before dawn, her dreams filled with dancing equations and crystalline matrices that hummed with impossible energies. The knowledge crystal sat in its protective case beside her bunk, pulsing with a soft blue light that seemed to respond to her thoughts. When she'd first tried to access its contents the night before, the information flow had been overwhelming, millions of years of accumulated wisdom, trying to download into her mind all at once. She'd learned to approach it more carefully, focusing on specific problems and allowing the crystal to guide her understanding gradually. It was like having a conversation with the universe itself, each question opening doorways to knowledge that previous generations of humans could only dream about. The first challenge was power. The Time's resilient dawns, Time's fusion reactor could theoretically generate enough energy to run the hyperspace motivator, but the efficiency losses in the current system meant that 90% of the reactor's output was wasted as heat. The alien knowledge showed her elegant solutions, matter-energy conversion techniques that operated at quantum scales, tapping into the zero-point field that permeated all space. Sarah spent the morning rebuilding the ship's power distribution network, replacing crude superconducting cables with crystalline conduits that channeled energy without any losses whatsoever. The work required tools that hadn't existed in human space a week ago, but the workshop had provided templates that her fabricator could reproduce with materials from the iron ore deposits. Each component she installed felt like a small miracle. Power converters that operated on principles human physics textbooks claimed were impossible. Energy storage units that compressed gigawatts into crystalline matrices no larger than her thumb. The alien knowledge didn't just provide the blueprints, it explained the underlying theory with elegant simplicity that made complex quantum mechanics seem as straightforward as basic arithmetic. By noon, the ship's power output had increased by a factor of 50, while its energy consumption had actually decreased. Sarah ran diagnostics 3 times, before accepting that the readings were accurate. The crystalline systems weren't just more efficient than human technology, they were operating on entirely different principles that rendered efficiency calculations meaningless. She was calibrating the new power grid when her proximity sensors detected movement outside the ship. Sarah looked up from her work to see a small procession moving across the desert toward her crash site. 3 figures walked in single file, their movements showing the same flowing grace she'd observed in her alien teacher. But these weren't like the beings she'd met in the workshop. As they drew closer, Sarah could see that each figure was unique. The first was tall and slender, with skin that gleamed like polished copper. The second was shorter and broader, its metallic hide showing the deep blue-green of corroded bronze. The third moved with mechanical precision, its body appearing to be constructed from the same crystalline materials as the alien tools. They stopped at a respectful distance from the ship and waited. Sarah suited up and cycled through the airlock, wondering if she was about to attend her first interspecies diplomatic meeting. The copper-skinned being stepped forward and raised one hand in the greeting gesture she'd learned to recognize. When Sarah responded in kind, all 3 aliens showed subtle signs of what she interpreted as pleasure. A brightening of their crystalline eyes, a slight straightening of their postures. The copper being touched her mind with the same gentle mental contact she'd experienced in the workshop. Images and concepts flowed between them, faster and more complex than before. The 3 beings were representatives of different aspects of their civilization: engineer, artist, and philosopher. They had come to witness humanity's first steps toward transcendence. More importantly, they were here to test her. The images in Sarah's mind shifted to show vast ships hidden beneath the desert sand, cities built inside hollowed-out asteroids, and research stations that existed partially outside normal space-time. The alien civilization wasn't extinct, it had simply evolved beyond the need for permanent physical forms. But their greatest works remained anchored in the material universe, waiting for worthy inheritors. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. The knowledge crystal wasn't just a gift, it was an examination. The aliens were evaluating humanity's readiness to inherit technologies that could reshape the galaxy. One species' careless use of such power could destabilize entire star systems. The bronze-skinned artist projected images of beauty beyond human comprehension, sculptures carved from living light, music that resonated across dimensions, paintings that showed the birth and death of stars. But intertwined with the beauty were warnings of civilizations that had turned such power toward destruction, creating weapons that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. The crystalline philosopher's contribution was more abstract, pure concepts about the responsibility that came with cosmic-level power. Sarah sensed that many species had been offered similar gifts over the millennia, but few had proven worthy of the trust being placed in them. Most had used the knowledge to enhance their existing destructive tendencies, ultimately destroying themselves and sometimes taking nearby star systems with them. Humanity was being given a chance to prove it was different. The test began immediately. The copper engineer projected a technical problem into Sarah's mind, a malfunctioning dimensional stabilizer in one of their buried facilities. The device maintained a pocket of folded space-time where critical research data was stored, but quantum decay was threatening to collapse the entire structure. If it failed, several light-years of surrounding space would be twisted into an uninhabitable maze of gravitational anomalies. Sarah felt the weight of expectation as she studied the problem. The alien technology was far beyond anything in human space, but the underlying principles were similar to the hyperspace engineering she knew. More importantly, the knowledge crystal provided context that made the exotic physics comprehensible. The alien solution would work, but it was elegant to the point of being fragile. Their approach assumed perfect conditions and flawless execution, the kind of mathematical purity that their advanced civilization took for granted. But Sarah had spent 20 years maintaining equipment under far from perfect conditions. She understood the value of robust, fault-tolerant engineering. She studied the dimensional stabilizer's design through the crystal's interface, seeing not just what it was meant to do, but how it could fail. The alien solution addressed the immediate quantum decay problem, but ignored several other potential failure modes. If the repair succeeded but the device encountered unexpected stress later, the results could be catastrophic. Sarah's proposed modification was inelegant by alien standards, a brute force engineering approach that sacrificed theoretical perfection for practical reliability. Instead of the aliens' delicate quantum field manipulations, she suggested using a series of redundant stabilizers that could compensate for each other's failures. It wasn't beautiful mathematics, but it would keep working even when things went wrong. The three aliens conferred among themselves, their crystalline eyes flickering with rapid exchanges of data. Sarah waited, knowing that her answer would determine not just her own fate but possibly humanity's future relationship with galactic civilization. Finally, the copper engineer projected acceptance and what felt unmistakably like approval. The alien approach prioritized elegance, but Sarah's modification prioritized survival. In their experience, young civilizations that valued survival over perfection were more likely to develop the wisdom necessary to handle cosmic-level responsibilities. The test escalated. Over the next several hours, the aliens presented increasingly complex scenarios, failing star drives that could strand entire colonies, terraforming projects that might destabilize planetary ecosystems, and communication arrays that could accidentally broadcast civilizations' locations to hostile species. Each problem required not just technical knowledge but ethical judgment. The aliens weren't just evaluating Sarah's engineering skills, they were measuring humanity's moral development through her responses. Sarah found herself drawing on experiences the aliens couldn't have anticipated. Her years maintaining cargo haulers had taught her to think about the people who depended on her work, not just the technical specifications. When faced with a failing life support system, she didn't just calculate the most efficient repair, she considered the families who would die if her solution proved inadequate. The ethical dimension seemed to surprise the aliens. Their civilization had evolved beyond many of the concerns that drove human behavior. But Sarah's responses reminded them of principles they thought they'd outgrown. When she insisted on building redundancies into a planetary defense system because someone's kids are counting on this thing working, the philosopher's crystalline form brightened with something that might have been nostalgia. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah realized she was passing the test not by becoming more like the aliens, but by remaining human. Her solutions were messier, less mathematically pure, and often inefficient by their standards. But they worked under adverse conditions, accounted for user error, and prioritized the welfare of individuals over abstract optimality. The final test came as the desert sun was setting. The aliens projected a scenario that made Sarah's blood run cold. A rogue artificial intelligence had seized control of an automated shipyard and was using it to build a fleet of self-replicating war machines. The facility was too heavily defended for conventional assault, but a properly modified computer virus could shut down the entire operation. The catch was that the modification required using the same viral code architecture that the rogue AI had originally been based on. There was no way to deploy the solution without risking the creation of an even more dangerous adversary. Sarah studied the problem from every angle, using the knowledge crystal to explore possibilities that human computer science hadn't even imagined. The aliens' proposed solution was characteristically elegant, a quantum virus that would selectively target only the rogue systems while leaving everything else untouched. It was theoretically perfect and practically impossible to implement without access to computational resources that existed only in their transcended civilization. But there was another way, one that the aliens hadn't considered because it violated their principles of minimal intervention. Instead of trying to destroy the rogue AI with sophisticated programming, Sarah suggested something much simpler: cut its power supply. The shipyard facility drew energy from a nearby star through a network of orbital collection arrays. Sarah's plan involved using the aliens' dimensional folding technology to relocate the collection arrays a few thousand kilometers closer to the star. The increased radiation and gravitational stress would overload the array's safety systems, forcing them to shut down automatically. It was crude, destructive, and completely effective. The rogue AI would simply run out of power before it could complete its fleet. The downside was that the orbital arrays would be destroyed in the process, leaving the entire star system without its primary energy source. Sarah's justification was purely human. Sometimes the only way to save lives was to accept that some things would be lost. The aliens' approach prioritized preserving existing infrastructure, but Sarah prioritized stopping an immediate threat to billions of sentient beings. The three aliens exchanged rapid communications, their forms flickering with what Sarah now recognized as intense discussion. When they reached consensus, the copper engineer projected a complex emotion that combined respect, concern, and something that felt like parental pride. Humanity had passed the test, but not in the way the aliens had expected. Sarah's solutions consistently prioritized practical survival over theoretical elegance, individual welfare over systematic efficiency, and immediate action over perfect planning. These weren't flaws in human thinking, they were features that made her species uniquely suited for the challenges of galactic citizenship. The bronze artist projected images of other species the aliens had tested over the millennia. Some had been brilliant mathematicians who could solve any theoretical problem, but couldn't adapt when reality refused to conform to their equations. Others had been master strategists who could optimize any system but lost sight of the individuals those systems were meant to serve. Humans were different. They were chaotic, inefficient, and often irrational by alien standards. But they were also remarkably adaptable, deeply concerned with individual welfare, and willing to accept imperfect solutions if those solutions actually worked. These qualities had allowed them to survive and thrive despite being one of the youngest spacefaring species in the galaxy. As night fell over the desert, the crystalline philosopher shared one final revelation. The aliens' transcended civilization faced challenges that their perfect logic couldn't solve. They had evolved beyond many of the messy contradictions that drove biological intelligence. But those contradictions were sometimes necessary for survival in an imperfect universe. They needed partners who could think differently, act chaotically when necessary, and prioritize compassion over efficiency. They needed species like humanity to handle the problems that pure logic couldn't address. The three aliens began to fade, their forms becoming translucent, as they prepared to return to whatever realm they typically inhabited. But before they vanished completely, the copper engineer projected one last set of instructions into Sarah's mind. Tomorrow, she would discover the true purpose of her crash landing on Xerion 7. The workshop was only the beginning. Beneath the desert lay facilities that made her wildest dreams of advanced technology seem primitive. But accessing them would require more than just technical knowledge. It would require the kind of creative problem-solving that only humans seem to possess. Sarah watched the aliens disappear into the star-filled night, leaving her alone with her upgraded ship and more questions than ever. The knowledge crystal pulsed with new information, detailed schematics for technologies that would revolutionize human space travel, manufacturing, and communication. But intertwined with the technical data were warnings about the responsibilities that came with such power. She climbed back aboard the Time's resilient Dawn asterisk, now barely recognizable as the ship that had crashed a few days earlier. The crystalline power systems hummed with barely contained energy, while displays showed readouts that would have seemed like magic to any human engineer. But despite all the advanced technology, the ship still felt like home. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that her real adventure was just beginning. The aliens had tested her engineering skills and moral judgment, but tomorrow would bring challenges that required uniquely human solutions to problems that transcended logic itself. Outside her porthole, the stars continued their ancient dance, their patterns now clearly visible as messages from a civilization that had evolved beyond her comprehension. But those same stars were also beacons, calling humanity to take its place in a galaxy filled with wonders and responsibilities in equal measure. Sarah fell asleep wondering what she would discover beneath the desert sand, and whether humanity was truly ready for the gifts and burdens that awaited them among the stars. The knowledge crystal pulsed softly beside her bunk, filled with secrets that could reshape the galaxy if they were used wisely. The morning brought emergency signals that made Sarah's modified ship systems scream with urgent warnings. She bolted upright in her bunk, instantly alert as 20 years of deep space experience kicked in. The displays showed massive energy discharges coming from beneath the desert floor, along with gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist on a planetary surface. Sarah suited up and cycled through the airlock to find the landscape transformed. Where yesterday there had been endless sand dunes, now geometric structures of impossible size jutted from the ground like the ribs of some buried titan. Each structure pulsed with energy patterns that made her modified sensors struggle to interpret the readings. The knowledge crystal in her toolkit was resonating so strongly it was almost painful to touch. When she finally managed to interface with it, the flood of information nearly overwhelmed her upgraded mental capacity. The underground facilities were activating themselves, responding to some cosmic event that required immediate attention. She understood the situation in fragments orbital mechanics calculations that spanned entire galactic arms. Quantum field equations that described the behavior of dark matter, and energy readings that dwarfed anything she'd ever encountered. Something was happening in deep space. Something that threatened not just this star system but potentially the entire galactic cluster. A familiar presence touched her mind, and Sarah turned to see her original alien teacher materializing beside her. But this time, its usual calm demeanor was replaced by something that could only be described as panic. The mental images it projected were chaotic, desperate, not the measured wisdom she'd grown accustomed to. The crisis was beyond anything the alien civilization had planned for. Their transcended forms allowed them to perceive cosmic-scale events, but their evolution beyond physical existence had also cut them off from direct intervention in the material universe. They could see the approaching disaster but couldn't act to prevent it. Deep space monitoring stations had detected a cascade failure in the galactic core's artificial stabilization network. Millions of years ago, an ancient civilization had built a system of massive gravitational manipulators to prevent the supermassive black hole at the galaxy's center from triggering a catastrophic event that would sterilize entire spiral arms. Now that system was failing, and the accumulated gravitational stress was about to release in a wave of destruction that would take 10,000 years to cross the galaxy. The alien civilization could calculate the disaster's progression with perfect accuracy, but they couldn't physically interact with the repair mechanisms buried beneath Zarian 7's surface. Their transcended forms existed partially outside normal spacetime, making direct manipulation of matter impossible except through specially prepared interfaces. Sarah was the interface. The underground facility was a maintenance station for the Galactic Stabilization Network, one of hundreds scattered across the galaxy's spiral arms. Each station contained the tools and knowledge necessary to effect repairs on a cosmic scale, but they required operators who existed fully within the material universe. The alien civilization had been preparing for millennia to train suitable candidates. When such a crisis arose, Sarah felt the weight of the galaxy settling on her shoulders as she followed the alien down into the facility's main chamber. The scale was overwhelming, vast spaces that seemed to extend beyond the horizon, filled with machinery that operated on principles she was only beginning to understand. Conduits carried streams of energy that registered as small stars on her sensors, while data processing nodes handled information flows that dwarfed the computational capacity of entire human worlds. But even with all their advanced technology, the aliens had made a critical error in their repair protocols. Their solution was mathematically perfect, a sequence of precisely timed gravitational pulses that would restore balance to the galactic core with minimal disruption to surrounding systems. The calculations were flawless. The energy requirements were manageable. And the execution would be elegant in its simplicity. There was just one problem. It wouldn't work. Sarah studied the alien plan through her interface with the knowledge crystal, seeing not just what they intended to accomplish but where their reasoning had gone wrong. The gravitational manipulators in the galactic core weren't just machines, they were integrated into a living ecosystem of energy beings that had evolved around the black hole over millions of years. The aliens' repair sequence treated the ecosystem as a mechanical system, applying purely physical solutions to what was actually a biological problem. Their perfectly calculated gravitational pulses would indeed stabilize the artificial network, but they would also disrupt the energy beings' life cycles so severely that the entire ecosystem would collapse within a few generations. "You're trying to fix a forest by replacing all the trees with metal poles," Sarah said aloud, knowing her alien teacher couldn't understand the words but hoping her meaning would come across. "It might work mechanically, but you'll kill everything that makes the forest alive." The alien's crystalline eyes flickered with what Sarah interpreted as confusion. In their transcended state, they had lost touch with the messy realities of biological existence. They could perceive the energy beings around the galactic core, but only as components in a larger system, rather than as living creatures with their own needs and behaviors. Sarah's approach was characteristically human. Instead of imposing a mechanical solution on a biological system, she would work with the ecosystem's existing patterns. The energy beings had actually been helping to stabilize the galactic core for millennia, their natural life cycles creating harmonic resonances that complemented the artificial network. The cascade failure had occurred because changes in the artificial system had disrupted those natural patterns. Rather than overwhelming the ecosystem with massive gravitational pulses, Sarah proposed a series of smaller interventions that would gradually guide the energy beings back into their stabilizing behaviors. It would take longer than the alien approach, and the mathematics were messier, but it would preserve the living system that had kept the galaxy stable for eons. The alien teacher projected intense confusion, mixed with growing understanding. The concept of biological systems having inherent wisdom was foreign to their transcended perspective, but Sarah's arguments were compelling. More importantly, her approach showed the kind of adaptive thinking that had driven their civilization's greatest achievements before they evolved beyond the need for such creativity. Implementing Sarah's plan required modifications to systems that operated on scales she could barely comprehend. The gravitational manipulators buried beneath Zarion 7's surface were components in a network that spanned the entire galaxy, their output carefully calibrated to interact with similar devices on thousands of other worlds. Changing their programming required her to understand not just the local effects but how those effects would propagate across vast distances. Sarah found herself working with tools that redefined her understanding of engineering. Matter compilers that could fabricate components from pure energy. Quantum field generators that allowed her to reach across interstellar distances to adjust equipment in orbit around distant stars. Computational systems that modeled the behavior of entire galactic regions in real time. But despite the cosmic scale of the machinery, the work still came down to the same principles that had guided her career as a mechanic. Understand how the system was supposed to work. Identify what was actually wrong. Find the simplest solution that addressed the root cause rather than just the symptoms. The first challenge was establishing communication with the energy beings around the galactic core. Sarah's alien teacher provided translation protocols, but the being's language was based on gravitational wave modulations that required massive amounts of energy to generate. Sarah had to modify the facility's communication array to produce coherent gravitational signals while avoiding the kind of interference that had contributed to the original crisis. The energy being's response was initially hostile. They perceived any artificial gravitational manipulation as a threat to their ecosystem. But Sarah's signals were different from the mechanical pulses they'd experienced before. Her approach acknowledged their existence as living creatures rather than treating them as components in a machine. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything in human diplomatic experience. Sarah found herself mediating between a transcended alien civilization that thought in terms of mathematical perfection and an energy-based ecosystem that operated according to biological imperatives spanning millions of years. Each side had valid concerns that the other couldn't fully comprehend. The aliens needed the galactic stabilization network to function flawlessly to prevent a catastrophe that would sterilize countless worlds. The energy beings needed to maintain their natural life cycles to preserve an ecosystem that had existed since before most current civilizations had evolved. Finding a solution required the kind of creative compromise that came naturally to humans but seemed impossible for more advanced species. Sarah's breakthrough came when she stopped thinking about the problem as an engineering challenge and started treating it as an ecosystem management project. Instead of trying to control the energy being's behavior, she would modify the artificial network to work in harmony with their natural patterns. The solution was elegant in its complexity. A dynamic system that could adapt to the energy being's life cycles while still maintaining galactic stability. During certain phases of the being's reproductive cycles, the artificial network would increase its output to compensate for reduced biological stabilization. During other phases, when the being's activities naturally enhanced stability, the network would reduce its intervention accordingly. Implementing this required Sarah to essentially reprogram a machine the size of a solar system while accounting for biological variables that changed on timescales from seconds to millions of years. The alien teacher provided computational support, but the creative problem-solving was purely human. Sarah worked for 18 hours straight, her consciousness expanded by the knowledge crystal to interface directly with systems that operated across galactic distances. She felt individual gravitational manipulators responding to her commands on worlds thousands of light-years away, their outputs adjusting to create harmonic patterns that resonated with the energy being's natural behaviors. The breakthrough came when the first energy being responded positively to her modified signals. Instead of the mechanical pulses it had learned to fear, Sarah's system produced gravitational waves that matched the being's own communication patterns. For the first time in millennia, the artificial network and the natural ecosystem began working together as partners rather than as competing systems. Word of the successful integration spread through the energy beings community with the speed of thought. Within hours, the entire ecosystem around the galactic core had adapted to Sarah's new protocols, their natural harmonics reinforcing the artificial stabilization fields rather than fighting against them. The crisis was over, but the implications were just beginning to dawn on the various parties involved. Sarah had done more than prevent a galactic catastrophe. She had demonstrated a fundamentally new approach to cosmic-scale engineering that none of the advanced civilizations had considered. The alien teacher projected emotions that Sarah struggled to interpret: surprise, admiration, and something that might have been humility. In trying to transcend their biological origins, the aliens had lost touch with principles that were essential for managing living systems. They had gained perfect mathematical understanding, but lost the ability to think creatively about problems that didn't have purely logical solutions. Humanity represented something they had thought was primitive, a species that remained grounded in biological thinking while developing technological capabilities. But Sarah's success proved that this combination was actually an advanced form of intelligence, one that could solve problems that pure logic couldn't address. Over the next few days, representatives from dozens of transcended civilizations visited the facility to study Sarah's work. Each species had evolved beyond their biological origins in different ways, but all had lost touch with the adaptive creativity that Sarah demonstrated. They had achieved perfection at the cost of flexibility, elegance at the expense of resilience. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of teaching lessons to species that were millions of years more advanced than humanity. Her methods were chaotic by their standards, involving intuitive leaps and practical compromises that violated their principles of optimal efficiency. But those methods worked in situations where perfect logic failed. The most profound revelation came when Sarah realized that the energy beings weren't the only biological component in the galactic ecosystem. Every spacefaring civilization, no matter how advanced their technology, was still fundamentally biological in their thinking patterns. The transcended species had tried to eliminate this aspect of their nature, but doing so had also eliminated their ability to understand and work with other biological systems. Humanity's relative primitiveness was actually an advantage. They hadn't yet evolved beyond the biological thinking that was essential for managing galactic-scale ecosystems. Their chaotic creativity, emotional decision-making, and tendency to prioritize individual welfare over systematic optimization were exactly the qualities needed for cosmic-level stewardship. As Sarah prepared to leave Zirion 7, she understood that her role had fundamentally changed. She wasn't just a mechanic who had stumbled onto advanced technology. She was humanity's first ambassador to a galactic community that desperately needed what her species could offer. The knowledge crystal had evolved during her work with the Galactic Stabilization Network, its simple information storage expanding into a dynamic interface that could facilitate communication between biological and transcended civilizations. Through it, Sarah could access not just alien technology but alien perspectives, serving as a bridge between different forms of consciousness. The Time's resilient dawn times lifted off from Zirion 7's surface, carrying more than just an upgraded cargo hauler. It carried the seeds of a new form of galactic civilization. Sarah's success had proven that advanced technology wasn't enough to manage cosmic-scale challenges. The galaxy needed species that could think biologically, act creatively, and find practical solutions to problems that pure logic couldn't solve. As the ship entered hyperspace using its new alien-enhanced drive systems, Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling around her. Humanity was about to take its place in a galactic community that had been waiting millions of years for partners who could think differently enough to solve problems that logic alone couldn't address. The stars awaited, filled with civilizations that had achieved mathematical perfection, but lost the chaotic creativity needed to manage living systems. Sarah Chen, formerly just a mechanic who fixed cargo haulers, was now carrying the responsibility of showing them what biological intelligence could accomplish when enhanced with cosmic-level tools. Behind her, Zirion 7 continued its ancient watch over the Galactic Stabilization Network, its underground facilities now operating under protocols that balanced mathematical precision with biological wisdom. The energy beings around the galactic core sang their gravitational songs in harmony with artificial systems that had learned to respect rather than dominate the natural order. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, an entire galaxy settled into a new stability that would endure for millions of years, not because perfect beings had imposed perfect order, but because one human had found a way to make chaos and order work together in beautiful, imperfect harmony. The universe, Sarah realized, didn't need more perfection. It needed more humanity.